It's a scene we've all seen too many times. A racist cop, full of arrogance and ignorance, targeting an innocent black woman. But what happens next will leave you speechless. Officer Mitchell doesn't just stop her on a routine patrol. He makes cruel assumptions, hurls degrading words, and tries to assert his power, thinking she's just another person he can bully. But what he doesn't know is that the woman he's confronting is no ordinary civilian. She's an FBI agent, and not just any agent. She's the lead investigator in his own department's corruption case. As tensions rise and Mitchell continues to dig his own grave, the twist that follows could end his career and his freedom. What will happen when the truth comes out? Stay tuned for the shocking moment that will change everything. Officer Mitchell had always been known for his reckless behavior, a man who thought his badge gave him the right to do anything without consequence. He'd harassed people of color for years, never facing any real punishment. His colleagues, too afraid or complicit, turned a blind eye, making him feel invincible. But things had been changing lately. Rumors had been circulating about an investigation into police misconduct within his department. He didn't think much of it until today. When he stopped her on the street, Agent Johnson kept her cool, even though her heart was racing. She'd been gathering evidence for months, quietly building a case that could bring down corrupt officers, starting with the ones closest to her. She knew how dangerous this moment was. Mitchell's behavior wasn't just reckless. It was a threat to everything she was working for. She needed him to slip up, to expose himself. Little did he know, Mitchell, growing more agitated by the second, muttered something under his breath, something that didn't quite sit right with Johnson. It was a name tied to the very corruption she'd been investigating. He didn't know it, but in that moment, he'd just confirmed what she had suspected. He was more deeply involved than anyone had realized. She could feel the walls closing in around him. "Why don't you just leave me alone?" Mitchell spat, his hands balled into fists now, eyes narrowing. His frustration was no longer just with her. It was with the situation, with everything he'd tried to hide. He was starting to break, and Johnson knew it was time to make her move. But she couldn't go too far, not yet. In the distance, she could see a patrol car approach. The new officer stepped out, a menacing smirk creeping across his face. "Everything all right, Officer Mitchell?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Mitchell's expression darkened, but before he could respond, the stranger continued. "I heard you were having a little trouble with our guest here." Johnson's pulse raced. She knew that voice. She had heard it on one of the wiretaps she'd set up during the investigation. It was the same officer who had been involved in the bribery ring she was tracking. Her mind raced as she processed the implications. She wasn't just dealing with a corrupt officer anymore. She was up against a whole network, a web of deceit and power that reached far deeper than she had ever imagined. The new officer's smirk widened as he walked toward Johnson, his eyes narrowing with ill intent. "You should have stayed out of this, lady," he said, his tone low and threatening. "You have no idea what you've walked into." Johnson's thoughts scrambled. She had hoped to expose the corruption one officer at a time, but this was something much bigger. And now she wasn't just fighting for justice. She was fighting for her life. Mitchell, now clearly nervous, shot a quick glance at the stranger. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, but the new officer ignored him. The tension between them thickened, and Johnson's instincts screamed that this was Johnson's mind went into overdrive. What was happening? Why were they backing off? Then the officer who had been part of her investigation team, Officer Daniels, stepped out of one of the patrol cars. His face was stone cold, his eyes scanning the scene with an unsettling calm. The shock hit her like a wave. Daniels was one of the last people she thought would betray her. He had been her closest ally, feeding her information, helping her gather intel. But now there was no mistaking it. The look in his eyes said it all. "Daniels," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't answer at first, just nodded slowly as if confirming something only he knew. Then his lips curled into a tight smile. "You were always one step behind, Agent Johnson. You really thought you were going to take down this operation." Her heart sank. Daniels, her trusted informant, had been playing both sides. The evidence she had so carefully collected, the wiretaps, the surveillance footage, it had all been fed to him first, and he had been feeding it directly to Mitchell and his network. "We've been watching you the whole time," Daniels continued, his voice cold. "You should have known better than to trust us." Mitchell, now standing off to the side, seemed to relax, his posture shifting from defensive to triumphant. "You really thought you could expose us, huh?" he sneered. "But you didn't see the bigger picture." Johnson's mind was reeling, the walls closing in around her. Daniels and the entire network had been working together, manipulating her at every turn. The very people she had trusted the most had been playing a deadly game, and she'd been nothing more than a pawn. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Johnson's phone buzzed in her pocket, a message from her team. "We've got you covered. Move now." It wasn't over. Not yet. She had one shot left. With everything she had, she took a deep breath and made her move. The next few seconds were a blur. She lunged for her phone and quickly activated the final piece of evidence she'd been secretly recording throughout the entire confrontation. The entire exchange, everything from Mitchell's threats to Daniel's confession, was now in the hands of her team. "Call it in," she shouted, her voice steady despite the chaos. At that moment, everything exploded into motion. Daniels lunged toward her, but she was ready. She grabbed his arm, twisting it with enough force to send him crashing to the ground. The sound of sirens grew louder as backup stormed in from every angle. Mitchell, realizing the game was up, turned and bolted for his car, but it was too late. Officers from both sides of the law closed in on him, the web of lies unraveling faster than anyone could have predicted. As the scene settled, the weight of the truth came crashing down. Daniels was arrested first, then Mitchell, and soon, the entire corrupt ring began to fall apart. But just as Johnson began to catch her breath, a final twist rocked her to the core. A text flashed on her screen from an unknown number. "This isn't over. We're just getting started." Her hands trembled as she read the message, the weight of it sinking in. The corruption had run deeper than she could have imagined, and the war for justice was far from finished. The game had just changed, and she knew one thing for sure. She was in this fight for the long haul. The arrest came swiftly, and the weight of justice finally began to settle over the corrupt officers who had been operating under the radar for years. Daniels, Mitchell, and the others were taken into custody, their web of lies exposed. As the investigation continued, more arrests followed, and the department was forced to reckon with the depth of its corruption. Agent Johnson, though exhausted, stood firm. She knew this victory wasn't just hers. It was a testament to every whistleblower, every person who'd fought against a system designed to protect the corrupt. But as the dust settled, the message from the unknown number still haunted her. The fight wasn't over, and new threats were already emerging. Still, Johnson felt a surge of hope. She had taken down the most dangerous players in this game, and for the first time in a long time, she believed that justice might actually prevail. For now, the battle had been won, but the war was far from finished.